All right, everybody. Just realized I don't even have this open and ready to go. If you're visiting with us, we're really glad that you're here. We are in 1 Samuel. We're doing kind of the whole book in a quarter, so we're going pretty quickly through the text. So this morning we're going to be covering 3 chapters, chapters 20 through 22. Give me just a second to get all the way set up here. All right. Let's go ahead and say a prayer before we begin the class. Father God, we thank you so much for this great book of 1 Samuel. God, help us to not see this just as history, but as prophecy. Help us to see Jesus the Christ in it. Help us to see ourselves in it and the kind of hearts that we ought to have. Help us to see the warnings. Help us to see the blessings. And God, just always help us to have open hearts and open Bibles as we study together. Be with us now. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so chapters 20 through 22, let's do a quick recap of everything that we talked about last time with Jacob. Okay, we're good. And there we go. So we talked a lot about in the last couple chapters how, remember that top 40 song in Israel that happened, which was Saul kills his thousands and David kills his 10,000s. Saul hears about that and he starts to get really jealous of David after David has slayed Goliath, and he goes out and does all these military victories. So his jealousy increases as David's success increases. Remember that Saul begins his attempts on David's life. He's got that trusty spear that he's going to keep with him pretty much the rest of the book, right by his side. And he tries to pin David down while David's playing the lyre a couple times. Remember we talked about David's 2 strongest allies being kind of his most unlikely allies, people you would think would be for Saul, and that's 2 of Saul's children, Michal, which was David's first wife, and then Jonathan, which is Saul's heir, right, his firstborn son. Okay? And then we also talked about this idea at the beginning of chapter 18. Jonathan strips himself of this princely robe and he gives it to David as kind of a deference, a sign to say, hey, I understand now that you are going to be the next king. And then at the end of chapter 19, where we ended, we had Saul being overcome with the Spirit of God, right? The first time that was a good thing. It was a sign for him that he was going to be king. And this time now it's a sign like, hey, Saul, it's over for you, man. Like, God is not, you're not in favor with God at all anymore. And Saul is stripped of his robes. And so the idea we kind of talked about, right, was that Jonathan decided to submit to the God's anointed one. Saul was forced to submit to the anointed one. So there's kind of a difference there, an application in our lives. Like, you either bow to Jesus now or you bow to him later. So at the very end of chapter 19, as Saul is prophesying before Samuel, kind of this forced prophecy, David runs away again. He flees Saul. And where does he go? Who's the person that he goes to? At the beginning of chapter 20. So not at the beginning of chapter 20, when we're starting now. So he leaves Samuel from Ramah, and where does he go at the beginning of chapter 20? Goes to Jonathan, right? Goes to Jonathan at the beginning of chapter 20. So let's think about that for a second. If you're trying to get away from Saul, of all places to go, why are you going back to his son? What? Okay, wait a second there. So isn't that kind of a dangerous place to go? Let's think about that for a second. Like, you're going back to where Saul is from, probably. That's where Jonathan is, probably in Gibeah. It's kind of a dangerous place to be, right? So yeah, why would he go there? Because he trusts him. A little bit more deep than that.
Sometimes the best place to hide is someplace nobody.
Okay. Yeah, maybe there's something to that. Look back at chapter 18, verse 3 with me. chapter 18, verse 3. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. We kind of just read over that, right? Where it's, okay, they made a covenant together. Don't really exactly know what that means, but they made a covenant, I guess. It's kind of amazing to me how many times I've read this text in chapter 20 and thought about being about just this intense friendship, when really I think it's about this covenant between the two of them. So they are bound now in chapter 18. They have made this pact together before God, and they're not going to break it. Think about the security in that for David. David knows that not only does Jonathan not want to harm him, he's bound to him in covenant. So David comes to Jonathan as the weaker party in this covenant, and there's safety for him in that. So what's the lesson there? When David is in distress, where does he run? To his covenant friend. Okay, so what's the lesson for us in that? If there was a small one.
Are we someone else's covenant friend?
Yeah, absolutely, right? When we're in distress, who are you going to run to? I'm going to run to my covenant friend, Jesus the Christ. Yeah, I'd never seen that before. I thought that was really cool to think about. So that's where David goes, is to his covenant friend. And they have this really emotional back and forth in this chapter, right? David's trying to convince Jonathan that Saul is against him. He's like, Jonathan's kind of a bit naive, right? Like, my dad tells me everything that's going on, and there's no way that this is happening. So they come up with this little test to see if Saul really does want David dead. Remember that Jonathan's going to cover for David's absences at the new moon feast. He's going to see how Saul reacts to those absences. And before we read that reaction, and spoiler alert, it's a pretty bad reaction. Let's read verses 12 through 17 that talks about Jonathan's response before they go test this out. So verse 12 of chapter 20. And Jonathan said to David, "The Lord, the God of Israel, be witness." There's that covenant again. "When I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow, or the third day, behold, if he is well disposed towards David, shall I not then send and disclose it to you? But should it please my father to do you harm, the Lord do so, and more also." The Lord do so to Jonathan, and more also, covenant language. "If I do not disclose it to you and send it away, that you may go in safety. May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord, that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever, when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." And Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies." And Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. What do you think about that? Are there any weird things in you to that? What's strange about that?
It's strange about that to me that he's basically wishing harm upon Saul because he's made a covenant with David that may you overcome your enemies, and Saul doesn't say that. Jonathan doesn't know.
Yeah, if there's anybody that's going to take the most blessing from David being taken out, who is it? It's Jonathan, right? But instead, Jonathan not only doesn't just sit on the sidelines, he says, "May God take vengeance on the enemies of David." He knows that's his dad.
I think it's interesting where it's in the verse 13 where it says, "May the Lord be with you as he's been with my father," like the Lord is still with Saul, but obviously not. So does Jonathan not know that, or?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a complicated topic because it's Jonathan's sonly duty, I guess, to be there for his father. So I think there's probably a bit of a warped misconception here, but in some ways I think he is still the king of Israel at this point, so maybe so.
Saul knows that the Lord's not with him, but Jonathan knows.
Yeah. Megan?
I think you also see here Jonathan realizing that not only is he not going to be the next king, but he's probably not even going to survive David becoming king, because he makes him promise to look out for his household. He doesn't ask for him to keep himself in his favor. So I think he truly understands how bad it's going to get for Saul and for himself, because as Saul's son, he is now David's enemy, even though he loves him as if he were himself. And I think you actually see a really cool picture of Jesus in Jonathan, because he's willing to give up every single thing for the benefit of David rather than to sustain himself.
Absolutely. So think about Jonathan right now. Jonathan's the stronger party in this covenant, right? At this moment, because his father's house is in power. He's the heir to the throne. The weaker party in the covenant comes to him in distress, and he doesn't do the normal thing. He doesn't secure his kingdom. He follows the covenant. He fulfills the needs of the covenant and says, may God bless you in this covenant, okay? And then think about David, who one day is going to be the stronger party in this covenant. And Jonathan saying, hey, when that happens, don't do the normal thing. The normal thing is wipe everybody out in my dad's house because you don't want anybody there to challenge you for the throne. Don't do that normal thing. I want you to spare my children, spare my ancestors. And absolutely David does that one day. But the conclusion there for me is that this covenant causes David and Jonathan to make countercultural decisions. Jonathan doesn't try to go after David because of the covenant. David doesn't go after Jonathan's kids someday because of the covenant. Same with Jesus and us, right? We make countercultural decisions because of the covenant that we're under now. Jesus made countercultural decisions for us because of the covenant he made with us. What thoughts do you have on that? Sir?
At this point in the story, Jonathan still doesn't believe that his father is the evil one. And he's like, well, my father swore to me he wasn't going to kill you. He swore by God that he wasn't going to kill you, so he's not going to. And so, as Alan mentioned, I don't think he realizes here that when he says that when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies on the face of the earth, he was talking about his family, essentially, his father's house. Because King Saul has become the enemy of God at this point in the story. But he finds out later on in this chapter that he still has hope, maybe, that Saul would change. He's been trying to get Saul counsel and try to see that David isn't such a bad guy. So I don't know, it's a picture of there still being hope for someone, maybe, that they would repent. But also there came a point where he said, there's no hope. Saul's just, he's on the wrong path.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Okay, so we kind of remember the rest of the story, right? Saul freaks out over David's absence. First night he's like, okay, this guy just must be unclean, so we're going to let it slide for one night. And then the next night, you remember what Saul says, that he doesn't even use David's name anymore, very much the rest of the story. What does he call him? Son of Jesse. Like, I'm not even mentioning his name anymore. It's the son of Jesse. Where's the son of Jesse? And Jonathan's like, oh, he told me he had to go back to Bethlehem on this trip. And Saul just explodes on Jonathan, right? He calls him the son of a perverse woman. He talks, and then notice, let's see, in verse 31, very significant there. For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. So what's Jonathan worried about? God's will, a covenant he's made with David. What's Saul worried about? His kingdom continuing. Okay, big difference between the two of them. Jonathan's no longer naive about his father. He kind of has a pretty good idea of Saul's feelings about David. Okay, so then Jonathan and David have this thing with the bow and arrow where they have this test to see, not test really, but more of a signal to see, to show David whether or not he can come back, or if he's kind of in exile now until Saul's gone. So obviously he's in exile now, and they part ways emotionally. They hug and they kiss each other. But then notice verse 42 there at the end. Then Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace." What a weird 3 words to start with, right? Like, I just found out my father hates your guts and everything is about to fall apart for you. Go in peace. But look at that next part. Because we have sworn, both of us, in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord shall be between me and you, between my offspring and your offspring forever. And he rose and departed, and David and Jonathan went into the city. Okay, so another point about covenants. Covenants bring peace. When you have someone on the other side who is a trustworthy person to be in a covenant with, Jonathan and David know, we know what, no matter what happens here, if Jonathan dies in the end or if he lives somehow, everything's going to be okay between us because we have a covenant between us. Application for us again, between us and Jesus. That covenant, that blood of the covenant that we're going to think about this morning, that should bring us some real peace. Because of any candidate to have on the other side that's trustworthy, goodness gracious, Jesus the Christ. Thoughts on chapter 20? Sure.
I think it's really important to look at this from David's condition and point of view. It's very similar, of course, to Jesus. Everything here is unjust. Everything here is wrong. And there are very few things in life, especially with trials, that are more difficult to handle when you know you're being accused of things that weren't so. And everything is just going south. Very difficult to deal with. And David, for the next number of years, is going to very, very much struggle with his own emotions and depression, all kinds of things, because he did everything he could to exalt Saul's kingdom, and he's getting nothing.
Absolutely, and we're going to see that later on with David and Abigail, right? Nabal is instantly like, I know how terrible of a person you are, that you're against your father Saul and all this, right? A lot of lies and misinformation are going to be spread around Israel about David. A lot of people even say that this narrative here is partially just a defense of David that's written later on to say, like, hey, just so you know, like, he was innocent of all of these things. Great point. Anything else? Okay, so we move on to chapter 21, and David flees. Jonathan flees the place where he is now, whatever, and comes to Nob. Okay, so what is at Nob right now that we know based on reading it? If we know the showbread is there, what do we know is there?
The priests are there.
No, the priests are there. The showbread is there. What does that mean is there? Tabernacle is there right now, okay? So notice David's line of thinking here. Really good to think about in times of distress. He goes to his covenant friend, and then where does he go next? He goes to the priests and the tabernacle. So the places he's going in his distress are places where he's going to find comfort and strength in God. Okay, and he goes to Ahimelech, remember, the priest up there, and he asks for some food because he's got all these men with him. And remember his situation here. He's running away. He doesn't really have a lot of resources. It's not like he has like these Yeti coolers full of, stocked things for him.
There's not a convenience store.
Exactly. There's not a convenience store. And so he asks Ahimelech for this, if he has any bread, and Ahimelech says, all I've got is this leftover showbread. Remember, so there's this bread that the priests bake, and they put 12 loaves of bread on the table. And it sits there for an amount of time, and then they bring it off and they put fresh baked bread in there again. Okay, so what he's saying is, the bread that I have left over, that's the only bread I have. Who's that bread for? Priests. Who else? Levites, maybe, I don't know. But essentially nobody else, right? I think it's just the priests. All right, so Ahimelech says, this is what I have. If these guys have been kept from women, then you can have it. How do we feel about that? Feels a little weird, right? Surface level. That's like, hey, but isn't this bread for the priests? right? Yes? No? Maybe? This bread is for the priests, so why does David and his men get to eat it? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but just think about that question a little bit, because remember, Jesus brings this up later as well. So David also asks for a weapon, because remember, not so long ago, there's not even a blacksmith in Israel, so there's not really a whole lot of weapons to go around. And Ahimelech's like, well, it's your lucky day. Remember that Goliath guy you killed a while ago? Well, I've got his sword right here. And he's like, there's none better. I'll take it and let's go. I always thought this is kind of strange. I'm like, if Goliath's sword is, 6 feet long or whatever, how's that really helping David very much? But who knows? Maybe he had a mini sword or something like that. That's true. He could clearly lift it up over here, right. So he gives him the sword, and David goes. And remember, the whole time, who's clocking all of this that David is doing? Doeg the Edomite. Yeah. Doeg the Edomite. What sort of red flags do you see about him in the text? A couple things. One of them is right there in his name. He's an Edomite, okay? Where did Edom come from? Esau, okay? Good guys, bad guys. Bad guys, that's right. Don't really have a whole lot of redeeming qualities. Remember, the book of Obadiah is all about Edom and how they kind of just sit there and laugh at the Israelites through all of their suffering. And God's like, you got it coming to you guys someday. So not really a whole lot good said about Edom in the Bible. So there's number one. What's the second red flag we see about him when it comes to David? He worked for Saul, yeah. He's the chief herdsman of Saul. So what does that kind of already tell us? That probably this news is going to get back to King Saul. Okay? So then David goes to kind of the last place on earth that you would think he would go. I'm still very confused as why he does this, but he flees and he goes to Gath. Okay, who's from Gath? Goliath is from Gath, right? So he takes that big shiny sword and he goes all the way to Gath. You can kind of tell, if anything, David's kind of desperate at this point. He's not going anywhere in Israel. Why do you think?
Because if he told where he is.
Yeah, probably that's true. Think about, we have the perspective of hey, it's okay, he's going to be king one day and everybody's going to like him in the end. But to Barry's point, he's kind of starting to become public enemy number one in Israel, where people are starting to really not support him because Saul is against him fully. So if you're for David, that means Saul is against you. Okay?
Plus, he's famous.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's famous. Everybody knows who David.
And so we're really not sure what David is expecting here, right? But they've heard that top 40 Israel song, the Saul has killed his thousands, David has killed his tens thousands. And they're like, I think we know who you are. You're that guy. Okay, so what does David do at that point? He's very afraid. So that's the first thing. Not very characteristic of David. We've seen Saul become afraid quite a bit in the text, but David has stood down mighty Goliath. Doesn't seem afraid at all. He's stood down Saul multiple times. This is the first time where he's really scared of the king of Gath here, Achish.
He lies.
Absolutely. So what does he do? He acts like crazy King Saul. Okay, that's what I kind of imagine. He's got the spittle going down his beard. He's writing weird markings on the ground. And I love King Achish's response, right? Look at verse 14. Then Achish said to his servants, "Behold, you see that the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen, that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?" Right, so he's like, I got enough crazy people. I don't need anybody else. Tell me the Bible doesn't have humor in it? I mean, come on, it's pretty funny. So he acts like he's crazy. Not the best moment for David, right? He lies, he's scared, and then he moves on to the next place. Okay, so we'll talk more about that at the end, how he felt about this, because we really don't get in this narrative how David felt about this. He just moves on to the next point, okay? So let's think about going back up to the showbread. Not why, is it okay for David to do this, to take that bread, okay? Look with me back at Matthew 12, not back, I guess forward to Matthew 12. We probably wouldn't think about the story too much else besides Jesus brings it up as a defense for him in this situation. And what I love about this is typically we study Matthew and then we say, let's go read 1 Samuel 21 real quick and try to get that context. Well, now we have got all the context of 1 Samuel behind us, and now we're going to go look at Matthew and try to see if we can figure out what Jesus is saying here. Okay, so Matthew chapter 12, starting in verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Okay, so he brings up this story of David eating the showbread, and he says it's lawful or not lawful for him to eat it. It's not lawful. Okay, so was it okay or was it not okay for him to eat it? It was okay. All right, give me a little more than that. What is Jesus' point here?
Is it more about the spirit of the law than the letter of the law?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the idea. I think the idea that Jesus is putting forth is that there's like a higher law, like you're saying, a spirit of the law than just the letter of the law. Even though the showbread was for the priests only to eat, Ahimelech saw a people that desperately needed food. Really, it's not like David was like, "Hey, don't worry about it. We'll go down to the convenience store and get our food there." David's like, "I need food. Do you have food?" And he's like, "Oh, no, sorry, this is just for the priests. Well, you can watch us eat it if you'd like. But God told us that you can't eat it," right? So silly, so nonsensical, because that's not the spirit of the law, right? The spirit of the law is love your neighbor, help the people in need. Okay, so yeah, I think that's exactly what Jesus is saying here. So application for us in that, please do not confuse what I say for situational ethics. It's not that kind of idea. Yeah, go ahead, Wayne.
You know, there are two kings. Jesus is saying, I'm king over the Sabbath. David was already anointed king. So there's another message. The message is that I'm king too. And God has anointed Jesus, that God has anointed me. And my servants do what the king says.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it as well. But think about that for us, application for us. There's sometimes a higher law than the quote-unquote lawful thing. Okay, so give me an example of that. On the way to worship, you see a fiery car crash. You're the first one to the scene, and you're like, it's 8:58. Like, I gotta be there. It's right down the street. So you drive on by, you pull in the parking lot. You were here because God commanded you to be here, to assemble with the saints. And you pass by the people that are dying in that car right there. Okay? There's a higher law. Think about the priest and the Levite with the Good Samaritan. They're on the road from Jericho to Jerusalem. We're not told what the priest and Levite were going to do. Maybe they were going to the temple to worship. Maybe they were going to the temple to fulfill certain duties. Does it matter? Because Jesus doesn't tell us. But it doesn't matter because excuses indict them, no matter what the excuse is. Because they passed by a dying man. They didn't love their neighbor. They didn't follow the spirit of the law. Okay, we can get in that trap sometimes when we get so rigid on, I have to be here, that there's not more important things sometimes that God has commanded us to do. Thoughts on that? Sir.
So there's also here, Matthew 12, understanding the spirit of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was healed, the Sabbath was to be addressed. It says in Mark's account, God didn't make the man the Sabbath the man. And that's one reason Jesus would heal on the Sabbath. So here's the disciples in need. They were traveling. There's no way they could have prepared the day before for their Sabbath. The Sabbath does not supersede the needs here of the individual.
Absolutely. Sir.
And it's your example is very similar to Jesus' example when he said, if your oxen was in a ditch on the Sabbath, would you get it out?
Yeah.
That's not, is that work? Yes. Are you breaking the law? Yes. But you saved your oxen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. What other thoughts do you have on, yes ma'am?
I have a question about the holiness aspect that is mentioned, like why it's so important.
Yeah, like why it's important that they've kept themselves from women.
Yeah, and I'm curious, like, is that has some, if Jesus is kind of declaring him and his disciples holy by comparing himself to David and his.
I don't know. I haven't thought about that. I've always looked at this as like, this is just, if there's going to be some sort of test of holiness, this is what Ahimelech puts forth. Because it's like, yeah, you guys aren't priests, but there's got to be something here. Something to help us decide this in the emergency.
It strikes me when David says, truly women have been cut from us as always when I go on expedition. The vessels of the shown are holy, even when it is an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy?
Yeah.
I'm just curious if something about their journey makes them holy, or if it's just because they've been cut from women because they're on the run, and so there's no time for that. Okay.
I think that's the idea that he's saying is like, we don't have time for wives and kids to come along. Like, we had to skedaddle out of there quickly, and everybody's vessel is holy at this point.
Very quickly, quotation from Hosea 6 verifies that there is a certain principle that is higher than a worship law. And in this case, I desire mercy, that's love, not sacrifice. It's not saying don't sacrifice.
Yes.
There's something higher than that, and that justifies the principle.
Absolutely. Okay. Any other thoughts? Yes, sir.
I think that has more, it might be having to do with cleanliness, because soldiers historically are associated with certain behaviors that lead to uncleanliness. And I think that there might be a concern of the priest it talks about their vessels. And I'm pretty sure that that's referring to certain parts of people, and he does not want them to connect their possible or possible uncleanliness to the showbread or the items that hold the showbread or any connection there. I think that's probably has something to do with that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, chapter 22 then. Before we get there, I'm glad I remember this. I think I've got a little laser pointer too. Oh yeah. So remember at the end here, I wanted to bring this up because geographically we get kind of like, okay, David moved on to that place. We don't really think about how far away that place really is. Like, David's on the run for a long time. Okay, so Ramah, who's at Ramah? You guys speak up. Samuel is at Ramah, right? Okay, so that's where David goes, and Saul is possessed by the Spirit of God. And then David goes down to Gibeah, probably. That's where Jonathan is right now, while Saul is still possessed or whatever. Gets a head start on him. Okay? And then he comes from Gibeah and he goes over to where? Gath, right? Sorry, you were totally right. He goes to Nob next, right? Okay, and that's where he steals the showbread. Not didn't steal the showbread. We just talked about that. I've been sick all weekend, so you gotta forgive me here. He goes to Nob. He takes the showbread, takes Goliath's sword, goes over to Gath. Okay, and after Gath, what we're going to see at the beginning of chapter 22. He goes over to the cave of Adullam. Okay, so not a super easy trek to come all the places that he's gone to. And you're going to see later, right, he's going to go like this and go like that and run all over the place away from Saul. Okay, never resting for a long time. I thought that was kind of a good...
And it's not like he's by himself. There's hundreds of men with him.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's going to get pretty frenetic for David here. The text verse can be like, and then he went here, and then he went here, and then he went here, and then he went here. Okay? So chapter 22, as we keep going, David leaves Gath, and he goes to his most luxurious spot yet, right? Adullam. And where does he stay in Adullam? In a cave. I spelled that wrong. But so he goes to the cave of Adullam, and there's this group of people that gathers to him, right? Everyone who is in distress, everyone who's in debt, and everyone who's bitter in soul, and they all gather to him. So talk about like a slam dunk Jesus picture here, right? Think about Matthew 11, the invitation we've already talked about. Jesus, the kings of Israel are going to take. Jesus' invitation is, all you who are weary and heavy laden, come to me, gather to me, and I will give you rest. So all the people in Israel that are disillusioned by Saul's kingdom, that have nowhere else to go, where do they go? They go to the true king, King David. David drops his parents off in verse 3 with the king of Moab. What do you think about that? Is that weird?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. What do you think it means about David? Yes, sir.
I think David's wanting to offer protection, and he knows that they're not going to get it in Israel, because if the rumors are still flying, people might be like, oh, David's parents are over here, and then Saul take out his parents to track David to come rescue them. So David's removing the trap and creating security.
Yes, it shows you how many friends that David has in Israel right now, that he trusts in Israel right now, right? That he's saying, I don't trust any of you guys, so I'm going over here to the foreign king of Moab, and that's where I feel like my parents are most safe. Jesus' picture again, right, of like the outcast king who has a pretty low reputation. Okay, and then I want you to notice verse 5. Read verse 5 with me. Then the prophet... come back here. Okay. Verse 5. Then the prophet Gad said to David, do not remain in the stronghold. Depart and go into the land of Judah. So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. What do you think about that?
He's got a prophet with him. I like that.
Well, apparently the prophet seems to go and find him, I think is the idea. So here's the picture, is everybody's kind of left David alone now. Like he's on his own now. He's got this group of kind of worthless nobodies with him, all the people that are in distress and in debt and bitter in soul. They're all with David now. And who's still with David? Even after all this, we kind of read over a verse like that where, and the prophet told him to do this, so he did that. God is still keeping him safe from danger, even in all this. What a comfort that had to be for David in that moment to say, like, all right, God, you anointed me a pretty long time ago. I'm kind of waiting here. And even still, God's saying, keep going. You can do this. Okay, and then we get one of these I don't know why somebody hasn't come up with like a TV show or whatever for Saul and David. I think this story is so TV showable or whatever. But it's like this, the villain scene that we have, like meanwhile in the evil villain's lair. Like this is kind of what verse 6 of chapter 22 is like. Now Saul had heard that David was discovered. Okay, and Saul is sitting at Gibeah. He's sitting under a tree. What does he have? That trusty spear. Okay? That spear has been with him already. It's going to keep being with him. And the idea is almost like the spear is a symbol of his growing insecurity. Why is it such a strange thing that Saul's got a spear with him? What do you think it's implying about Saul? He doesn't trust anybody, right? He's got this growing paranoia. And we're going to see in this little speech he has here. Doggy, it's 9:41. He's got this little speech here where he's essentially saying, like, nobody loves me. For those of you that like The Lion King, it's this very king scar to me. This idea of, like, I'm king now, but nobody loves me. Nobody wants to help me anymore. If you look at verse 8, let's go ahead and read that. That all of you have conspired against me. No one discloses to me that my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day. Okay? 8 times, me or my. So what does that mean? Insecurity breeds pride. Okay? He's so worried about himself that all he can think about is himself. Okay? We're just seeing this downward spiral. But who do we have to save the day, to bring Saul's ego back up, that's going to tell about David? Doeg the Edomite is Saul's only ally here. Okay? Saul summons the priest from Nob. They come before him. Saul is blind with rage and jealousy towards them, and Ahimelech seemingly says, like, I didn't know about this feud that you guys have between you. And Saul's like, you're lying. You guys are all going to die. Okay? So he tells his servants, this is very classic Saul, right? He's like, I'm not going to be the one to do it. You guys go kill all those priests. Okay? And what do the servants say? Yeah, they all just kind of stand there like, you're asking us to kill priests? But who is there to save the day? Trusty Doeg, the Edomite, is like, I'll do it. So he kills all those priests. Look at verse 19. And Nob, the city of the priests, he put to the sword. Both man and woman, child and infant, ox, donkey, and sheep he put to the sword. Look back at chapter 15. When Saul is told to wipe out the Amalekites, verse 3, now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Okay, so what's the picture there? The picture is Saul would not do it when God tells him to do it, but now that it's his own murderous, jealous, blind rage, I'm going to wipe everybody out. Okay, so he's very clearly against God in this. Warning for us, look at where Saul got to. Unrepentance, jealousy, pride, look what that leads to. Abiathar, the only surviving priest, he goes and flees to Nob. And what does he have with him? An ephod, yeah. That's going to be really important next week because David's going to be able to ask God now directly, like, should I do this or should I not do this? And God's going to tell him. Okay? Really quickly, I want to do a plug for Wednesday night. If you're able to be here Wednesday night, this is so cool. So, how did David feel after being super afraid and deceiving the king of Achish, or Achish the king of Gath, and fleeing Gath? How does he feel after that? Because the narrative just kind of moves on, and then David did the next thing. Well, we know how he feels after that. Go read Psalm 34. Psalm 34 will tell you how David feels after he did this thing. Okay, how did David feel about Doeg, the Edomite? We don't really get a whole lot of information about that. Go read Psalm 52. We're going to study this one on Wednesday, where David's got some pretty strong feelings. But the amazing thing about David is that he puts them before God. And he says, God's going to take vengeance on you. Okay? And that's a pretty beautiful thing. Psalms offer us a much deeper glimpse into David's heart and motivations. And that's just explains a lot more how he is the king after God's own heart. Thank you, guys.